wanted to dedicate an episode of the Prometheus Shot to talking about Disney because I knew that Disney's story, Disney's work blends imagination with management and innovation. And as I was doing the research, I discovered a great number of things. I mean, some things are somehow obvious, like the impacts on culture, but other things, like the identity of Disney. Who is Disney? Who is Walt Disney? And who is Disney, the company? This is a very interesting question to explore. Disney himself, is he an animator? Is he a filmmaker? Is he an entrepreneur? Is he more than that? What was he really? And as I read some of the details about his life, about his works, more and more pieces of the puzzle started appearing, but it still is a mysterious question in a sense. What was Disney really? He is about entertainment, about family entertainment in a sense. The Disney empire is a huge business conglomerate now that has all these different parts. Disney himself in his lifetime got like 20 plus Academy Awards. But the impact now of the Disney empire, which has more than 60-70 billion dollars of revenue per year and has a market value of more than $200 billion, impacting the lives of millions of people. And it is quite interesting because there are many production companies in the world. But can you say that any of them has a strong brand like Disney? Can you say that any of them has the impact on culture that Disney has? This close relationship between the individual, the vision, the imagination, and the impact and works of the company. Disney owns Pixar, Lucasfilm, 20th Century Fox. There are so many. And Disney has done a great job in transforming all these brands, all these characters, all these stories into material culture as well. So when we think about Disney, when we think about Walt Disney, we ask this question on people and ideas, right? How can we define individuals really? Especially if they are great individuals who do these amazing works of achievement, grand things that touch the lives of others. It becomes kind of tricky defining them. We, as I discussed in a couple of the previous episodes, the genius defies classification in a sense. So it is difficult to define the individual. Do they represent themselves? Do they represent their time? Do they represent cultural trends or history around that particular period? This will be something we will try to explore as we go deeper into the Disney story. It will be difficult, but we will try to represent this by looking at some of the great works, the great events in the Disney story, and how they reflect the power of symbols and knowledge, and how knowledge can become power and reality in a sense. We will look at moments of courage and vision and perseverance, and how these interact with resources and mobilizing resources, an army of resources as I call it. We will look at the small details, the infinity, the multitude of small details that great individuals need to manage around and this management of all these little details reflects a unique position, a unique stance, a unique vision on life, right? This itself is a reflection of identity, and it is very interesting in the Disney case. Disney's relationship with knowledge has been very interesting since the beginning because the projects that Disney undertook required a blending of different knowledge fields, different areas, and I did some basic research on all the different aspects, the different knowledge fields that needed to be handled, managed, understood to produce the works that Walt Disney produced. And it's very interesting. There was, the different projects starting with the animation, but then when technology started being a major component in animation, but also the work on when we moved to feature films or the work when we moved to parks. And this required knowledge of so many different fields, including, in addition to the cinematic, to the artistic sides, knowledge fields as disparate as urban planning, engineering. They had at a certain point NASA engineers working in Disney. And the connecting line, the connecting thread of all of this is insatiable curiosity. As Walt Disney himself says, that we have this curiosity and we will keep on going, keep on exploring new things, and we'll come back to this point of relentless exploration in addition to the ruthless exploitation, as we call it. So this has been present in the park and in the films. Disney pioneered talk about this in a short while. The term called Imagineering, to blend imagination and engineering and to blend storytelling with the technical aspects of all of this. But here it's very important to say that all these different fields of education were important since the beginning, and Disney established what they called the Disney University, which had different tasks, from educating employees on knowledge fields themselves. By the way, Disney, it is reported that he used even to drive some of the early employees to different places so they can study, they can take courses, and then at the end he started getting educators and instructors to the company to give courses to the employees. So the Disney University, it is something that exists till now. You can look it up. It teaches things related to Disney, but it has an important role, which is the perpetuation or the communication of values, of the Disney values, the Disney culture. And this sort of contributes to self-identification that these great companies, these companies with a strong legacy have. Disney mastered knowledge flows, we can say. I talk elsewhere, this is part of my research, about cultural resources and how cultural resources can be used as economic resources in a certain point. And we see this very clearly with the different works of Disney, in the sense that popular heroes, popular stories, folk tales are utilized in a sense, especially in the beginning, right? So we use these stories, these heroes that everybody knows about. Three Little Pigs, Snow White, Belle, etc. These all come from folklore, come from folk stories, right? But they come from folklore, they go into animation, and then they go back into the folklore, into popular culture, but in a different form, in an adapted form. And this is very interesting. This also has to do with Disney's ability to master and improve and refine the art of storytelling. And a crucial step in this is the short animated film, The Three Little Pigs, which marks one of the early points of using original music, original sound with character development, with these relatively complex, sophisticated story compared to many of the products that were available at the time. So this creation of heroes and myths, this sort of redesign, repackaging of heroes became part of the Disney legacy. And this is even before the birth of Mickey Mouse, right? So adaptation first, but creation next. And if we look at the whole history, this kind of becomes clear, right? The development of these characters, them becoming heroes, up till the acquisitions of Pixar, Marvel, Lucasfilms, and Star Wars, and all of these characters becoming part of the Disney empire and becoming part of something I will mention next, which is this vast set of intellectual property that Disney owns and utilizes. But first, the management of creativity is no easy task. And here, Disney again had great innovations in this. First, the storyboarding process, the storyboarding practice was developed or formalized, we can say, at Disney by Webb. And then Disney systematically used it. This storyboarding process is very interesting in creative endeavors, particularly like in animation, because you could draw the storyboard, you could give a visual impression to the whole team, and you can transform these ideas into something that is common and that can be developed commonly. As I said, Disney coined the term Imagineering, and this is a blend of imagination and engineering, and it blends a number of storytelling practices, of artistic practices with technological practices. And I was looking online at some of the videos. You can look them up on Disney Imagineering, and there are some very amazing and beautiful things being done there. Disney has been at the forefront of technology adoption since the beginning, and this is again a very interesting story. So Disney has a number of inventions to his name. Things like the multiplane camera to provide more depth to animation, started since 1937. Synchronized sound in Steamboat Willie, the first to introduce synchronized sound, which went on to become an integral part of entertainment. The use of colors, so Flowers and Trees is the first short animation to use color in this sense. Different attitudes related to animatronics, as we mentioned, utilizing them in the parks. TV adoption itself, Disney was preparing all the things they recorded for TV, anticipating TV, even when other studios, other companies felt very skeptical and were afraid of the launch of TV. So Disney always tried to embrace technological innovation, and this has been part of the company's DNA since the beginning. Another important point here is IP, is the value of intellectual property. to the Disney story. Disney, based on a request from one company, created Oswald the Rabbit. This was one of the first characters that were developed. And Oswald is very significant because after it seemed that Oswald would be a great success, there was a dispute, and the producer had his name somewhere here, took the character because Disney had signed papers giving the IP of Oswald to the distributor themselves. This was very interesting. So when Oswald was taken from Disney, this is when he created the character Mickey Mouse. Now, Mickey Mouse was Mortimer the Mouse in the beginning on the train ride coming back from New York when he learned that he had lost Oswald. And then Lillian, his wife, suggested that you need a better name than Mortimer. But this early problem with intellectual property sort of developed Disney's ideas on the topic, and he became very aggressive, very adamant about owning the intellectual property of the characters that he creates. And this has been a great milestone in the development of Disney. After creating Mickey Mouse, in a couple of years, Walt and Roy was his brother who was more focused on management, sort of licensed the use of Mickey Mouse to someone to create writing tablets. And the first deal was like $300. It was very small. But this opened up a lot of possibility. And I read somewhere that in like 1931, 1932, there were 10 million Mickey Mouse ice cream cones sold in the United States. So this idea of utilizing intellectual property in so many different fields to create merchandise and to generate more economic opportunities. So the ownership of intellectual property, the ownership of these heroes, the ownership of these stories has been very interesting because Disney was able to reuse them over and over, and he had explicitly this kind of strategy of re-releasing films, right? You own the property, you can re-release it. And this has been one of the foundations enabling Disney to be strong in its current offering of the streaming service, for example, this huge database, this huge library of content that Disney has. So the creation of these heroes, myths, stories, when they became brand, when they became strong and valuable intellectual properties, they kind of provide a sustainable resource for the company. A number of ideas related to vision, courage, and planning stand out when we talk about Walt Disney. First, it is very interesting throughout his career, throughout his work, this relentless move forward, right? Always moving forward. So he started working on advertising material, moved to Laughogram, where they created these short sequences that would play before the films. The company went bust, the Laughogram. Then moved to short features that would also play before films. And then he created the first animated feature film, which is Snow White. Then moved to live action, then moved to the park. There were always new challenges to move to. And this is because of Walt Disney's vision, continuously evolving, continuously changing vision. He famously said, after the Three Little Pigs was very successful, he famously said when people asked him to create more Three Little Pigs episodes, he said, you can't top pigs with pigs. So we're always trying to top the previous work, always trying to move forward in a relentless way. And this is very interesting with Walt Disney because it involved a large degree of courage. Snow White was very unlikely. People were very skeptical, a feature animation film. But he had the vision. The film cost 3 times the expected cost. He was expecting something like $500,000, ended up costing like $1.5 million, putting a lot of strains on everyone, taking on a lot of debts. And Disney went through this frequently in his early career, mortgaging his house, selling everything he had, moving from one place to another, borrowing more money, almost depleting his brother Roy, which we'll also talk about. So the same happened with Disneyland, not just with Snow White. By the way, Snow White was a huge success after the film launched, netting around $8 million. I read somewhere that this is equivalent to $1 billion now, and this would make it the most gross return film in history, something to double check. Disneyland was the same story. So many people thought that this is going way over budget, this will never work, and so on. And Walt Disney put everything on Disneyland, everything that was achieved. And this was a common characteristic. He would hit success at one milestone, take all this money and put it back into the company in the next big project, always betting big, right? So always betting everything that was created or that was gained so far on the next big project, always having this vision for continuous change. An example of where this adaptation and flow happened is also during the Second World War, where Disney started working with the US government. This relationship has always been there. As a big company, Disney has worked a lot with the US government on a number of programs related to the military, related to propaganda purposes during the war, maybe after the war. There were programs related to promoting certain things that the government wanted promoted, right? Like, how do we get the people to endorse spending millions of dollars on space programs? Disney will create a cartoon with that. I read somewhere that in a meeting between Churchill and the US president, he asked him about one particular Disney film related to the promotion of the Air Force. And so these things have always been interconnected. Disney adapted, used whatever resources were needed to keep the company moving, to keep the company growing. There were always more things, more experiences, more challenges to attempt. And this is why, by the way, the identity is hard to define, right? Because whenever Disney was successful in one thing, he would move to the next and he would say, been there, done that, time for the new thing. And this is why I mentioned in the beginning, who is Disney? If you're always moving, always growing, always changing, you become harder to define. The point I want to talk a little bit more about, connecting it to this point of identity, is the army of resources. So Disney wasn't an animator, as we agreed. He fired himself from the animation department to focus on all the other things early on. He wasn't also a traditional management, and he wasn't a film company executive in a sense, because he had all these other projects. I mean, himself and Roy, his brother. So Disney was a general who mobilized armies of resources. He was a knowledge architect. He was a connector of so many different things. So in terms of funding, he built this great network of relationships with people who trust him, who invested in his projects. I mean, I read somewhere, and this was very interesting, one of his early companies, Laughogram, he wanted to get like $11,000 in funding, and he got that from people who invested $200, $300 each. So imagine he had to convince all these investors from early on in the career, and he developed this skill. This is a very important skill, the ability to convince people to part with their money, to put their trust in you in that sense. And Walt Disney always put the money back in the next project. Right? Put the money back in the business. This is what we mean by relentless. Other resources include all these different great animators he worked with. His friend Ob, who is, I think, admittedly better than Disney in animation, but nowhere nearly as successful. So there were always these animators, and some firms tried to take away his animators at different points in time, and there were interesting things related to that. His development of different network resources, distribution network, the structure of the industry sometimes made Disney feel a little bit limited, and so his brother Roy had the idea to create Buena Vista, which will distribute the works of Disney. Again, Buena Vista grew to become one of the biggest distribution companies in the space, I believe. The IT technology resources, and these include IPs, different practices, different innovation related things, and importantly, intellectual property includes all these characters and heroes and myths and stories that Disney created, each one of them a generative, powerful, productive brand in itself, right? So Disney had this huge army of resources, as we say, mobilize an army of resources. It included funding, money, networks, acquaintances, human resources, artistic talent, and importantly, different types of intellectual properties in addition to the material ones, which I didn't talk a lot, including the land purchases and the acquisitions. What connects all this? Again, it's the brand. It's the strong Walt Disney brand. It is all associated with his vision, his courage, and he connects all of these resources together with the integrity, with the unifying vision, connecting it all. He once is reported to having said to one employee, "We are selling one thing here, and that is the name Walt Disney." Interestingly, being a man of courage, a man who has mastered vision, a man who has mastered knowledge, doesn't mean that you can overlook the details. This is a very interesting point here. Disney's work and Disney's career was characterized by curiosity, insatiable curiosity, as we mentioned, but Since his early years, he was obsessively involved in so many different endeavors, always taking on new projects, trying new things. He would always entertain his friends as a child. This was interesting. He showed an interest in drawing early on, and we always have these childhood passions always coming back later in life in some form or another. So he would entertain the customers of the nearby barber by drawing cartoons of them, and he would get free haircuts in return later. He worked in selling items on a train. He worked in driving an ambulance in Europe. Many different endeavors that he and his brothers had to go through because of the overall situation of the family. So one research I read said that out of a big number of entrepreneurs of similar achievements, Walt Disney by far had the greatest number of different experiences, different work experiences before the age of 21. All of this is before the age of 20, mind you. So this is very interesting, and this has shaped his thinking, his approach, his energy in a sense. Failures had a great impact on Walt Disney's work. Early on, we mentioned the case of Oswald the Rabbit and this guy Mintz, who took away Oswald the Rabbit. But ask yourself, do you know Oswald more or do you know Mickey Mouse more now? Have you heard of Oswald? So this is very interesting to look at. The studio he created for shorts, Laugh-O-Gram, went bankrupt, and this put a lot of pressure on him, and he packed and went to Hollywood. This was one failure. Both these failures gave him lessons in the importance of owning your own intellectual property and the importance of sound financial management, something he developed later. Walt Disney had a very clear work ethic. He was close to burnout a couple of times, probably because of stress, probably because of managing all these details. But he says that he has always appreciated his work, he has enjoyed it, and this is a common feature that we see with many of these people we are talking about. There is a very clear plurality at work here. Walt Disney used to ask for multiple drafts of everything. He had this concept called plussing, which is always working on adding something to the idea, improving it. He was obsessive about the continuous refinement, continuous improvement of ideas. It is very important here to mention the role of Roy separately, because I think that Roy had a great effect on Disney's overall success. At one time, when Disney moved to Hollywood, he was willing to try any kind of different job. He wanted to be a director, and Roy advised him to stick to animation and helped him funding and otherwise. In managing the company, in managing the Disney company, Roy had a great role. The Disney company was called Disney Brothers in the beginning, by the way. This was a person whom Walt could trust and who added a lot to the management, to the financial side, keeping everything grounded, working on fees, working on all these details, while Disney focused on other aspects of the work. And he provided support in very difficult times. And we frequently see this in some of these cases. There are times in which the creator, the genius, is near the edge, right? And then a thin line of help, a small amount of help, makes all the difference on the long term. So if we want to talk about details and the brand, we have discussed how this strong vision that Disney had affected all the projects that he undertook. So we have the person and his vision. This was, I think, interestingly captured by something he mentioned when he was talking about the park. And he viewed the park, he viewed Disneyland as a living organism. And even though he put a lot of attention to detail in all the other objects, he says, when they are done, I couldn't improve them anymore, even if I was dissatisfied, while this park was always alive, always changing. And we see here this example of the living vision of Disney. He was very attentive to detail in all the projects he works on. There are a number of cases that I read, quite funny actually. Sometimes he would scold the animators because Mickey was angry, yet his tail was not in the right position for an angry Mickey. Somebody would tell him something and he would say, no, Mickey would never do that. So he would pay a lot of attention to these details. One time when they were working on Bambi, he got deers into the studio so the animators can observe them and can work on how to match them realistically. If you want, as I mentioned before, go and see the Imagineering studio videos on YouTube. There are very interesting examples of how this attention to detail has gone through the DNA, has gone through the blood of the company and is present on so many different aspects now. This is how culture evolves. We tell the stories. So the details, the management of details on the long run create the brand. Right? There is a clarity, there is an identification. And we see the rise of a secret force, of a hidden thread that unifies all the stories, brings them together into one big story. And I think that Disney's meticulous attention to detail played a great role in that. So to conclude this interesting discussion on Disney, I want to say that there are so many stories that I didn't mention. I tried to show the broad lines related to knowledge, planning, to detail. And so I ended up with many stories, many events that I didn't have time, and the recording is already too long. So to conclude, I'd like to reflect on a couple of points. First, stories of stories and the life of culture. This is how culture evolves. This is how culture moves. There are always new stories, new heroes being born. Stories create more stories, and values sitting in the stories reflect themselves on the world and on people's interpretations. Heroes keep moving, new heroes are born every day. But Disney's management of stories of heroes, creating this giant system that, in our minds, it is associated with family, entertainment, with imagination. But Disney has a great, disproportionate, somehow scary cultural impact. Right? It impacts how people think, how children grow up, who their heroes in life are, and consequently what their values are. This is a very interesting point to notice and has to do with the legacy of Walt Disney, the legacy of all these works, the interesting role of chance in it, and how identity itself becomes problematic, not easy to define. So back to the initial question, who is Disney? Well, it's a story of imagination. You assume that it should be clearer to define, but this is before you look at the details, right? Chance, multitudes, different encounters, and individual interpretations here are very important and make all the difference. Disney and Mickey Mouse encapsulate it all. But who is Disney and who is Mickey Mouse? So they encapsulate it all, even if they really don't, right? Because these identities are not very clear. So does it matter really who they are objectively and actually? Well, it's just layers of personal discovery from there, right? What people fill in the gaps with their own ideas. So stories are not necessarily about the truth, right? They are frequently about emotion, imagination, and identification. And this is the Walt Disney story.